Jennifer Capriati was once considered one of the greatest talents that American tennis had ever produced. A true prodigy who stepped into the spotlight at just 13 years old and immediately shocked the entire world by reaching the semifinals of the French Open in 1990, becoming the youngest player in history to do so, then quickly climbing into the world top 10 while still a teenager, something even legends rarely achieved at that age. Not stopping there, in 1992, at just 16 years old, she represented the United States at the 1992 Summer Olympics and defeated top names like Steffi Graf to win Olympic gold, a feat that turned her into a national icon overnight. Continuing that string of success, Jennifer kept winning WTA titles, building a reputation as one of the greatest young players in history. And even though her career was interrupted, she rode one of the greatest comebacks ever when she won the Australian Open in 2001, then conquered the French Open the same year, followed by another Australian Open title in 2002, rising to world number 1 and becoming one of the few players to ever reach the absolute pinnacle of women's tennis, and finally being inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame as undeniable proof of her legacy. But behind all those titles, those trophies, and that spotlight was a painful story that not everyone is ready to face, because Jennifer Capriati was not just a champion. She was also a child forced to grow up too soon, a fragile soul thrown into the pressure of an entire nation where every victory was celebrated but every failure was cruelly magnified, and when those expectations became too heavy, she collapsed, was arrested, was criticized, and had the whole world turn its back before she even had a chance to understand herself. Those lost years of wandering, depression, and loneliness dragged her to the deepest bottom of life, where fame no longer meant anything and the future seemed closed off. But right in that darkness, a stubborn will began to form. Quietly and without attention, Jennifer fought every day to stand up, to find herself again, to return to the court not for glory but because she refused to let her story end in pain. And that very resilience turned her from a fallen prodigy into a symbol of survival, a person who had been through the worst and was still strong enough to keep going. Before moving forward with the story, please hit subscribe and leave a heart. That is how you acknowledge a child who had to grow up under pressure that no one saw. Because what you are about to witness is not just the downfall of a prodigy, but the painful journey of a human being who lost her childhood to chase a dream that was not chosen by herself. After the night when the whole of America witnessed a child collapse, the story must go back to where it all began, where a dream was planted very early and grew so fast that there was no time for a child to understand what was happening. Jennifer Capriati was born in 1976 in New York City, in a family carrying the very familiar aspirations of immigrants, where success was not just a desire, but almost an obligation. Her father, Stefano Capriati, an Italian-American man with a fierce belief that his daughter could become a legend, not just an athlete, but a name that could change history. And that very belief, even though born from love, gradually became an invisible pressure that covered every month and year of Jennifer's childhood. When the family decided to move to Florida, seen as the center of American tennis, that decision was not simply a change of residence, but a turning point that shaped her entire life. From that moment, Jennifer's life was no longer measured by the normal days of a child, but by hours of practice, number of matches, and progress that had to be achieved. Every morning of hers began while the sun had not yet risen high, with repeated shots until her wrists were numb. Every afternoon stretched out in endless movement drills. And every evening was not for rest, but for her father, analyzing every mistake, every moment she was not good enough. Stefano was not just a father, he was a coach, a manager, the one controlling the entire trajectory of her life. He decided where she would compete, who she would meet, how she would train, even how she should think about winning and losing. In his world, there was no room for weakness, no room for hesitation, and certainly no room for a free childhood. Jennifer grew up in an environment where everything revolved around the goal of becoming a champion, and that meant other things had to be sacrificed. She had no hangouts with friends after school, no lazy days like other kids, no moments allowed to make mistakes without being judged. Instead, there were days repeating in strict discipline, where every shot carried expectations, every match carried pressure, and every failure carried a sense of guilt. There were days she left the practice court with her body exhausted, but what tired her most was the feeling that she was not allowed to stop, not allowed to weaken, because behind her was a dream bigger than herself, a dream that her whole family, and gradually the whole country, was placing on her shoulders. And the most painful thing was that Jennifer had no chance to choose. She was never really asked if she wanted this life or not, because when you start a journey like this from such a young age, you do not know that other paths exist. You will believe this is the only life possible, and therefore Jennifer accepted it. She accepted the exhausting hours of training, accepted the expectations that never decreased, accepted trading her childhood years for a future she had not even had time to clearly imagine. Stefano believed he was building a great opportunity for his daughter, and, in a way, he succeeded. He created an extraordinary athlete, a talent the world had to notice, but at the same time, he unintentionally created a pressure that no child should ever have to bear. Because in the process of building a champion, they had lost something far more important, the ability for Jennifer to live like a normal child, to make mistakes without fear, to play without being judged, to grow at her own natural pace. And when those things were taken away, what remained was not only a perfectly forged athlete, but also a soul that had not had time to fully develop. A person who grew up too fast but lacked the emotional foundation to face what would come later, because pressure can create success, but it can also quietly destroy from within. And in the case of Jennifer Capriati, those childhood years, those days that seemed to be only discipline and progress, had actually sown the seeds of exhaustion, of loneliness, and of an emptiness that she would only truly feel when the spotlight began to fade, when there was no one left to cheer, and when she had to face herself, not as a prodigy, but as a human being who had lost too much before she could understand the value of what she once had. Continuing from those childhood years shaped by discipline and expectations, the moment Jennifer Capriati stepped into professional tennis at age 13 was not just a step forward in her career, but a leap out of the world of a child, where everything happened so fast that no one realized they were placing a fragile young life into the blinding lights of global attention. In 1990, at the French Open, a tournament even seasoned players had to respect, Jennifer, at that time just a little girl with a face still full of childish features, marched straight into the semifinals, defeating opponents who were older, stronger, and more experienced. And every shot of hers was not just a point, but a declaration that something extraordinary was happening. The entire tennis world was stunned, not because they had never seen talent, but because they had never seen talent appear so early. Commentators could not hide their amazement. American newspapers immediately put her name on the front page, calling her a phenomenon, a prodigy, the future of American tennis. And from that moment, Jennifer Capriati was no longer an ordinary individual. She became a symbol, a hope, a face that an entire nation bet its future on. Endorsement deals began to appear, interview invitations followed one after another, camera lenses followed her every step, and a 13-year-old girl, who should have been living carefree days, had to learn how to answer the press, how to control her image, how to become the person the public expected. But behind all that praise, behind the applause and camera flashes, Jennifer was still just a child who had not yet understood why she was standing there, who had not yet understood why everyone was looking at her with such expectant eyes. There were nights she returned to the hotel room, not with the joy of victory, but with an indescribable exhaustion, a feeling of emptiness creeping in between the compliments, because she had no time to fully feel the joy. everything happened too fast match after match, success after success, and each victory did not bring relief, but only added more pressure to keep winning. Stefano was still there, watching every step, adjusting every detail, and although he was proud of his daughter, that pride was rarely shown with gentleness. It usually came in the form of higher expectations, loftier goals, stricter standards. Jennifer began to understand that at this peak, there was no room to slow down, no room for mistakes. And the scariest thing was, she started to believe her value was tied to winning, that if she lost, she would no longer be what everyone expected. And that very belief quietly formed a pressure she could not name or share, because around her there was no one who truly saw her as a child. They saw a phenomenon, a talent, a symbol, but no one asked if she was happy, no one asked if she was tired. And while the whole world was celebrating the rise of a new star, Jennifer Capriati was gradually losing the small but most important parts of her childhood, little by little, quietly, without a sound, like a price that no one realized had to be paid until it was too late. And then 1992 arrived like a destiny that seemed nothing could stop. Jennifer Capriati, who was only 16 years old at the time, stepped into the 1992 Summer Olympics in Barcelona with the eyes of the entire United States watching her. She was no longer just a rising phenomenon, but had become a real hope, a symbol that people believed would lead American tennis into a new era. Each match that passed was not only a sports competition, but like tests of destiny. And Jennifer, with a composure far beyond her age, successively overcame names that anyone would have to respect, including Steffi Graf, a legend at the peak of her form, and Arantaxa Sanchez Vicario, a stubborn and highly experienced opponent. Those victories not only shocked the experts, but also made the whole world stop to watch a 16-year-old girl doing what seemed impossible. And then, in the final, when the last point was scored, when the cheers rang out, and the American flag was raised high, Jennifer Capriati had become an Olympic champion, a moment that should have been the peak of joy, a beautiful memory she could keep for life. But for Jennifer, that moment carried a very different feeling. Because while the whole of America was celebrating, while the media called her the new queen of tennis, while millions looked at her with admiration and pride, inside her something was quietly dimming. After the match, in the quiet hotel room, with no more cheers, no more camera flashes, no more praises, Jennifer sat alone with the gold medal in her hand. And instead of feeling complete, she felt exhausted, a fatigue that came not only from physical effort, but from the months and days being swept into the non-stop wheel of success. She felt lonely, not because there was no one around, but because no one truly understood what she was going through. No one saw a child trying to hold herself together amid expectations that were too great. And deep inside, Jennifer began to realize a truth she had never dared to name, that the life she was living, no matter how brilliant, was not entirely her choice, that every step, every victory, every title had been shaped long before she was old enough to say what she wanted. And that very feeling of being trapped, the feeling that she was living in a dream not chosen by herself, began to creep into her mind like a faint shadow that kept growing. And in the moment that should have been the happiest of her life, Jennifer Capriati instead faced an emptiness that no victory could fill. Because when a child reaches the peak too early, what she loses is not only time, but the opportunity to understand herself. And from that moment, Jennifer's journey was no longer just the journey of a champion, but became the journey of a human being gradually realizing that the price of the dream is sometimes greater than any victory. But Olympic glory was not the stopping point. It was only the beginning of a period where everything around Jennifer Capriati became much bigger, noisier, and far heavier. In a short time, she was no longer simply a talented young tennis player. She became a cultural phenomenon, appearing on the covers of major magazines, her face in advertising campaigns, commercial contracts pouring in, and the name Jennifer Capriati was mentioned as the new symbol of American sports. A perfect girl that every brand wanted to associate with. A success story that the media never stopped exploiting. And from the outside, her life seemed like the dream that millions longed for. But the deeper she stepped into that spotlight, the more Jennifer realized that fame was not a gift. It was like a golden cage, beautiful and sparkling, but with no way out, where every step she took was watched, every word was analyzed, every expression could become a headline. She was no longer an ordinary girl who could step outside without being recognized, could not take a walk without cameras following, could not live a day without feeling she was being observed. And in that world, the simplest things, making friends, hanging out, making mistakes, growing up, became luxuries. Jennifer had no real friends her own age because very few could understand her life, and very few approached her without being influenced by her fame. Relationships became blurred, unclear between sincerity and exploitation, between closeness and distance, and gradually she learned to withdraw into herself, not because she wanted to be alone, but because that was the only way to protect herself in a world where everything could be magnified. There was no freedom, no private space, no right to make mistakes without being judged. And the most painful thing was that Jennifer did not even realize she was being deprived of those things, because she had never had the chance to experience another life. She did not know what a normal teenager looked like, did not know what it felt like to be carefree. All she knew were training schedules, match schedules, media appearance schedules, and expectations that never stopped. Each victory only increased the pressure. Each failure became a big question she had to answer in front of the public. And over time, that pressure began to wear down her psychology quietly but irreversibly. There were moments she felt she no longer controlled her own life, that everything was happening too fast and too big, that she was being swept away by a current she could not stop. And while the world looked at Jennifer Capriati and saw a star shining brightly, inside her a different feeling was forming. A feeling of being trapped, controlled, and losing herself. And the scariest thing was that no one around noticed it, because in their eyes, she had everything: fame, money, admiration. But no one saw that what she lacked was the most basic thing: a real teenager's life. A life she could freely choose, and that very deficiency, day after day, little by little, created cracks in her soul. Cracks that would eventually no longer be hidden forever. And then, what no one wanted to believe finally happened. Not on a big court, not under the lights of a final match, but in a small, ordinary moment that would have been almost meaningless if it happened to anyone else. But with Jennifer Capriati, it became an earthquake that shook the entire United States. In 1993, when she was only 17 years old, Jennifer was arrested in Florida for stealing a small item from a store, a ring of insignificant value, an impulsive act, almost unconscious, but its consequences were more terrible than any loss she had ever experienced, because this was no longer a mistake in competition. This was a public collapse of the image that the whole nation had carefully built. In just one night, the name Jennifer Capriati no longer appeared on sports pages with praises, but flooded the news with cold headlines, heavy words: fallen prodigy, failed symbol. And for a girl who had not yet grown up, this fall was not only shame, but an indescribable mental shock. Because, for the first time in her life, she was no longer seen as a champion, but as a problem, a mistake that needed to be judged. And what hurt most was that no one stopped to ask why. No one looked deeper into the years of pressure that had quietly accumulated. No one wondered what had made a girl who once had everything act that way. All they saw was a broken image, and they reacted by turning their backs. But the tragedy did not stop there. 1 year later, when the aftershocks of the incident had not yet settled, Jennifer was arrested again, this time for using marijuana in a hotel. And if the first time was a shock, then the second was like a sentence, a confirmation in the public eye that her story had ended. The media showed no mercy. They not only reported, they judged. They built a narrative of downfall in which Jennifer was no longer a human being but became a symbol of failure. They wrote that the tennis prodigy had become a national tragedy, that she had wasted her talent, that she was a warning for dreams that were too big. And amid all those voices, Jennifer almost disappeared, not because she wanted to hide, but because she no longer knew where she could stand in a world that had once honored her and then turned its back so quickly. She left tennis without an official statement, without a goodbye, simply vanishing from the courts that had once been her whole world. And that silence, for many, was proof that she had collapsed, that she could not come back. But for Jennifer, it was the time when everything became the most blurred, where her identity, which had been built entirely around tennis, suddenly disappeared, leaving an emptiness she did not know how to fill. There were no more match schedules, no more pressure to win, but also no goals, no direction, and right in that emptiness the real pain began to become clear, no longer covered by the spotlight or the noise of the media. Jennifer had to face herself, what she had been through, what she had lost, and a question she had never had to answer before. If she was not a tennis player, then who was she? And while the whole world concluded that Jennifer Capriati's story had ended, in reality this was only the first chapter of a much deeper tragedy. A tragedy that lay not only in what had happened in public, but in the silent battle inside a human being trying to find herself again amid the ruins of a dream that had once been so brilliant it blurred everything that was truly important. And then when the stage lights went out, when the sensational headlines gradually gave way to newer stories, what remained in Jennifer Capriati's life was not peace, but a long darkness that no one truly saw. The years that followed had no victories, no titles, no applause, only a heavy silence enveloping a person who once lived in the attention of the entire world. Jennifer fell into a state she could not name, an emptiness coming from losing the only thing that had ever defined her. Tennis was not just a career. It was her identity, the reason to wake up every day, the way she understood who she was, and when it disappeared, all that was left was a void she did not know how to fill. The days passed without structure, without goals, without any sense of moving forward, only swirling thoughts in her head, questions without answers, and a feeling of being left behind by the very world that had once celebrated her. Jennifer began to experience signs of depression, even though at the time she might not have been able to name it. She felt tired even when doing nothing, felt heavy when facing a new day, felt lonely even when there were people around, because no one truly understood what she was going through. And while the world looked at her with judgmental eyes, she began to look at herself with doubt, wondering if everything they said was true, if she really was a failure, a wasted talent, a cautionary tale. And those thoughts, repeating every day, gradually became an inner voice she could not turn off, a voice that kept reminding her of what she had lost, of what she no longer was. Jennifer once said there were times she did not know who she was if she was not a tennis player, and that statement was not an exaggeration. It was a painful truth, because when you spend your entire childhood becoming something, you have no chance to discover other parts of yourself. You do not know what you like. You do not know what you want. You do not know who you can be outside the role others placed on you. And when that role disappears, you do not just lose a job. You lose yourself. Jennifer tried to find balance again, but it was not easy. Because every time she stepped outside, every time she appeared in public, she had to face the eyes of people who remembered her not as a champion, but as a story of failure. Those eyes did not need to speak words, but they were enough to make her feel she no longer belonged in that world. And gradually she began to withdraw into herself, not because she wanted to live in isolation, but because that was the only way to avoid the constant reminders of the past. But that isolation only made everything worse, because in the silence, negative thoughts had more space to grow, memories of what had happened became more vivid, questions about the future became more frightening. There were days Jennifer felt like she was drifting with no destination, no direction, no clear reason to continue. And the most painful thing was that she had to go through all of that while still so young, when she should have still been in the stage of exploring life, learning how to grow up, learning how to understand herself. But instead she had to face problems that even adults would find hard to handle. And, while the world kept moving forward, Jennifer Capriati was trapped in a stretch of time where everything seemed to stop, where the past was still too close, the future too blurry, and the present too heavy to endure normally. But even in that deepest darkness, however faint, there still existed something that had not completely disappeared. A part of her still remembered the feeling of standing on the court, still remembered the feeling of hitting a perfect shot, still remembered the feeling of fighting. And that very memory, however small, however weak, became a ray of light she held on to, not because she was sure she could come back, but because it was the only thing left connecting her to the version of herself before everything fell apart. And in a world where she felt the whole world had turned its back, holding on to that small part, even if it was only a memory, had become an act of survival, a way not to completely disappear in her own story. And then, from that long darkness that seemed to have no way out, Jennifer Capriati began to think about something she herself was not even sure she still had the strength to do. Returning to the tennis court, not as a grand announcement, not as a welcomed comeback, but only as a small, fragile, almost desperate thought, like a person drowning reaching out for anything that could keep her afloat. She returned to training. The first shots were no longer as sharp as before, the movements no longer as light as in her memories. Her body had not only weakened after the long time away from competition, but her mind also carried too many unhealed wounds. Every time she held the racket, it felt like facing the past, facing what she once was and what she had lost. But the biggest difficulty did not lie in physical condition or technique. It lay in the way the world looked at her now. Because in the eyes of many, Jennifer Capriati's story had ended long ago. They no longer saw a champion. They only saw a has-been, a wasted talent, a warning rather than a hope. Experts began to say openly on television that a comeback was impossible, that modern tennis had changed, that younger and stronger players had taken her place, that someone who had collapsed like Jennifer would never be stable enough to return to the top. Those comments were not just professional analysis, they were like public sentences being pronounced. And every time she stepped onto the court, she had to face not only the opponent across the net, but also the doubtful eyes from the spectators, the cold silence instead of the roaring applause of the past. There were matches she lost quickly, there were matches she fought but still fell short, and each defeat felt like a reminder that maybe they were right, that maybe her story really had ended. But what made this journey more painful than anything before was the loneliness. Because this time Jennifer no longer stood in the spotlight with an entire system behind her. There were no more praises, no more contracts, no more nation placing expectations on her shoulders. She had only herself, a racket, and a decision no one understood, no one fully supported. There was no cheering loud enough to drown out the doubts, no guarantee that all this effort would lead to anything good. And there were days she wondered if she was fighting for something that no longer existed, if she was trying to return to a world that had already cast her out. But then, every time she stood on the court, even if it was just a small court with only a few spectators, she still felt something familiar. A feeling she had lost during those lost years, the feeling that she was alive, that she was doing something that deep inside she had never truly given up. And that very feeling, however fragile, kept her moving forward, step by step, slowly, painfully, but without stopping. Jennifer Capriati did not return to tennis to prove to the world that they were wrong. She returned because that was the only way to find herself again. And while the whole world had given up on her, while every door seemed to have closed, she kept going, quietly, uncertainly, but persistently, alone. like a person trying to rewrite her own story from the lines that had been crossed out. And then, after all those years of being forgotten, after the quiet training sessions with no spectators, after the losses that no one even bothered to mention anymore, Jennifer Capriati stepped into a tournament that even she herself was not sure she still belonged in. The Australian Open in 2001. She was no longer the 13-year-old girl who shocked the world, no longer the Olympic champion the whole of America had once been proud of, but only a name trying to come back from the past. A name that many believed was past its prime, and each round that passed was not an easy step forward, but a real battle, where she had to face not only the opponent in front of her, but also the doubts that had followed her for nearly a decade. Each shot no longer carried the innocence of raw talent, but carried the weight of painful years, memories of failure, of isolation, of the times the whole world turned its back. And then she advanced to the final, facing Martina Hingis, the world #1 at that time, the symbol of the new generation, someone many believed would easily end Jennifer's fragile comeback story. And under the bright lights of the big match, the contrast became clearer than ever. One side the current peak, one side the past trying to live again. But what no one could measure was what Jennifer had brought into that match. Not just technique or tactics, but 10 years of collapse, of depression, of loneliness, of being doubted, judged, and forgotten. And those very things had turned her into a different person, no longer as fragile as before, no longer dependent on others' recognition, but with only one goal left: to keep standing firm. Each point played out like a struggle not only of physical strength, but of will. There were moments she thought she would collapse. There were times old memories flooded back, reminding her of past failures. But this time she did not give up. This time she did not run away. And when the final point was scored, when the match ended, Jennifer Capriati stood there, not as a prodigy, not as a fairy tale, but as a human being who had just stepped out of a long, painful journey. And then she cried. Not tears of a simple victory, not the explosive joy of a Grand Slam title, but tears that had built up from 10 years earlier, from the days she was arrested, and the whole world turned its back. From the nights she did not know who she was. From the training sessions when no one believed she could come back. From the words that a comeback was impossible. All of that gathered in that moment and broke into tears that no title could fully explain. Because for Jennifer, this was not just a victory. This was proof that she had survived, that she had not been completely destroyed by what had happened, that even though the world had given up on her, she had not given up on herself. And in that moment, on the distant court in Melbourne, a story that many thought had ended long ago was suddenly continued, not with perfection, but with resilience, not with pure talent, but with the strength of a person who had walked through darkness and found the light again, even if only in a fragile moment, but enough to change everything. And then after the brilliant moment at the Australian Open, Jennifer Capriati did not stop. Because that victory was only the first step of the journey she had to fight for throughout 10 long years to find herself again. In the same year of 2001, she stepped into the French Open, a place that had once witnessed her failures and unfulfilled expectations. But this time, everything was different. Each shot, each movement, each decision on the court radiated confidence, calmness, and willpower that only those who had been through the deepest darkness could truly understand. Jennifer marched straight to the final, facing top players in the world, players who in the past had been considered superior to her, but now, thanks to years of tireless training and months facing failure, she'd become stronger both mentally and technically. And when the final point was scored, Jennifer won the French Open title, a victory that was not only about the trophy, but also proof that she had stood up after the whole world thought she was finished. And just a few weeks later, with consecutive wins in other tournaments, Jennifer rose to become world #1, becoming the #1 female tennis player in the world, a position many thought she would never reach after the years of collapse. The interrupted career and the enormous pressure from the media. The girl who had once been considered a failure, who had once had the whole of America turn its back on her, was now a world champion, living proof of one of the greatest comebacks in tennis history. And in the eyes of those who had once doubted and criticized her, that change was almost unbelievable. Jennifer stood at the peak, holding the trophy, looking back at the path she had walked, looking back at the years she had struggled with loneliness, collapse, and terrible pressure. And tears fell not only because of the victory, but because of all the pain she had been through, all the challenges that seemed impossible to overcome, all the doubts she had heard from everyone. And right in that moment, Jennifer Capriati was no longer the child crushed by pressure, no longer the prodigy the world had once doubted. She was living proof of the power of willpower, of the resilience of a person who knew how to stand up, how to fight, how not to let the past define her future. And with a world #1 ranking, she also proved that the greatest victory was not only titles or silver cups, but the ability to overcome darkness, to rise after every tragedy, and to show the whole world that a child once forgotten could still become a legend, could still rewrite her own story with her own hands. But victory and the world #1 position did not bring Jennifer Capriati the peace she deserved, because her body, which had endured harsh years since she was a child, began to speak up with pains that could not be ignored. Many years of continuous competition from age 13 had left serious consequences, and now injuries started to appear one by one. Her shoulder was no longer as flexible as before. Her wrist that had once been a sharp weapon in forehands and backhands was now stiff. Her knees ached after every quick movement. All the things that had once made the perfect shot now became difficult, and gradually Jennifer's form began to decline. The shots that used to be full of power now lacked precision, speed, and force. In every match, she clearly felt that her body could no longer meet the demands a world champion needed, and the disappointment appeared not only in the results, but also in the feeling that she was betraying herself, that the years of training, the lingering pains, the childhood sacrifices, all seemed to be wearing down every muscle and every smile. The long training days and hours on hard courts from age 13 had accumulated into persistent pain, making every twist, every run, every ball strike a challenge. And that pain was not only physical but also mental, because Jennifer had once been used to winning to prove her own value. But now, even when she gave everything, the results sometimes did not meet expectations, and that made her feel helpless, as if both her body and her will were fighting against each other. And although she knew that any professional athlete had to go through injuries, for Jennifer it was not just a sports matter, but the consequence of having to grow up too fast, of carrying pressure from too young an age, of competing when her body had not yet fully developed, and now facing younger, quicker, stronger opponents. She had to fight not only against them, but also against her own body. Every match became a double battle between strategy and technique, and between strength and lingering pain. Doctors, coaches, and physical therapists became indispensable companions, helping her find ways to reduce pain, recover, and search for every bit of lost energy. But even when doing everything, Jennifer still knew she could not return 100% like her peak years, and the fear that these injuries could cause her form to slide became a ghost that haunted every tournament, every serve, every movement, every counterattack. And yet the fighting spirit still burned strongly in her, because Jennifer understood that form was not only about technique or physical condition, but also about willpower, about the ability to overcome pain, and she still continued to step onto the court, even knowing her body had paid too high a price. Each shot was not only an expression of talent, but also proof of the will to survive. Each match was a reminder that a true champion is not only defined by titles, but also by the ability to stand up and fight, even when the body betrays, even when pain wears down every cell. And, thanks to that inner strength, Jennifer Capriati continued to prove that she was not only an outstanding tennis player, but a symbol of resilience, a person who knew how to endure, how to push beyond her own limits, and how to stand up every time life challenged her in the cruelest way. And then, after the years of struggling with injuries, with non-stop pain, with pressure that no longer came from the spectators but from her own body, Jennifer Capriati realized that her time for tennis was gradually running out. The court lights seemed to dim with each slowing step, and when she decided to leave tennis, she was just over 20 years old, an age that should have been full of joy, full of discovery and freedom. But now only memories remained of the courts, of the serves, of the victories and failures watched by the world. Each day and each tournament that had passed was no longer a path to conquer, but became a chain of painful memories mixed with glory, making Jennifer ask herself if she had had a normal childhood, if she had not been forced into the prodigy path, whether she could have become an even greater legend, whether she could have enjoyed every moment of victory without being haunted by what had been lost. That question was not just idle imagination, but a lingering pain. Because in Jennifer's mind, the stolen childhood could never be taken back, and every title, every silver cup, every recognition from the whole of America, no matter how brilliant, could not compensate for the days she was not allowed to be a child, not allowed to play, not allowed to make mistakes without being judged. And that very absence had left deep scars, scars she had to carry in every decision and every step afterward. When she left tennis, she carried not only the feeling of losing her youth, but also the pressure of having to redefine herself, of having to find who she was outside the court. And that path was not easy at all, because for many years, Jennifer had been defined by her victories, by her talent, by her fame. And now, when all of that left, she had to face a great emptiness she had never faced before. That emptiness contained what had been lost, the opportunities that would never return, and the loneliness, disappointment, and self-blame she had once suppressed throughout her youth surged stronger than ever. Each day that passed, Jennifer had to find ways to live with those feelings, had to learn how to love herself when the world no longer cheered her, had to learn how to stand up without the court lights shining on her. And throughout the years after leaving tennis, she struggled to find her own identity again, to realize that a person's value is not only measured by titles, by fame, or by admiration, but also by the ability to survive trauma, the ability to face the past without being completely crushed by it. And in that darkness, Jennifer Capriati began to learn how to slow down, how to breathe, how to step out of the shadows one step at a time when no one cared anymore, how to accept that a part of her would never be recovered, but she still had a future, still had the ability to shape a new life, not as a prodigy, not as a symbol, but as a real human being. And thanks to that willpower, Jennifer began to find inner peace again, to find the strength to keep living, even though the court lights had gone out, even though every eye in the world had turned away. She still knew that her story had not ended, and she would continue to write it in her own way. And then, after the court lights gradually faded out completely and every title had become a memory, Jennifer Capriati stepped into another phase of her life, a phase that few people outside her family and close ones truly witnessed. Life after tennis was not as brilliant as the victories, not dressed up with spotlight or roaring applause, but was quiet days silently facing herself, facing wounds that had not yet healed, facing painful memories that still followed her like a shadow that never left. And in 2010, Jennifer had to be hospitalized after an overdose, an incident that shocked the public, with the press and fans following every detail, questioning and gossiping. But few understood that it was not just a random fall, but the result of many years of accumulated stress, pressure, and loneliness that she had endured since she was a prodigy. From the years of stolen childhood, from the constant pressure of competition, from the expectations the whole of America had once placed on her shoulders. And many realized that even after leaving the court, Jennifer's battle was still not over, because she was not only fighting opponents on the court, but also fighting herself, fighting mental wounds, fighting an inner collapse that few could imagine. In the days and months after leaving tennis, she faced depression, anxiety attacks, sleepless nights, wondering what her own value was, whether she was still the Jennifer Capriati the whole world had once admired, or only a part of a person worn down by the past. The hospitalizations were not just the last straw, but manifestations of total exhaustion, where physical and mental merged together. And during that time, Jennifer began to realize that she could not keep running away, could not let the pain and trauma define her forever. She had to face it, had to stand up, had to find a way to keep living, even when surrounded by curious eyes, non-stop gossip, and judgments from people who had never been through what she had been through. And step by step, day by day, she learned how to take care of herself, how to face loneliness, how to endure without needing to prove anything to anyone. There were days she felt completely collapsed. There were moments. Everything became too much to bear. But right in those seemingly hopeless times, Jennifer found small but important moments. A smile from a friend, a conversation with family, an eye that understood who she was, beyond titles and fame. And step by step, she learned how to rebuild trust in herself, how to feel life without the court being the center of the universe. Each tear, each pain, each disappointment became bricks building inner strength, helping Jennifer gradually stand up after a fall that seemed impossible to recover from. And although the world still looked at her through the lens of the past, still had doubts, still had gossiping stories, Jennifer knew she had found the most important thing: the ability to heal herself, the ability to survive, the ability to keep moving forward even without lights shining on her. And with each passing day, when she did small things for herself, she realized that the greatest victory was not medals or titles, but the ability to hold on to herself, the ability to stand firm at the ruins and still have the courage to smile, to keep living, to once again believe that this life still had meaning, that Jennifer Capriati was not just a tennis player who had once collapsed, but a human being who had learned how to rise again from pains that few had seen. And then, after all those years facing darkness, facing loneliness, and wounds that had never fully healed, Jennifer Capriati was finally recognized not only for the shining titles on the court, but for the entire resilient journey she had been through. In 2012, Jennifer was inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame, proof that the sports world honors not only victories, but also the ability to rise after failure, the ability to turn suffering into strength, and the ability to inspire future generations. This event was not only a milestone in her career, but also recognition for her personal journey, from a teenage prodigy crushed by pressure, a child who lost her childhood, to a world champion, a symbol of resilience and willpower. Jennifer's story became an important lesson for sports, reminding people of the dangers of placing too much pressure on young talents, of the importance of caring for athletes' mental health, and of how fame and success can become a double-edged sword if not managed carefully. Moreover, Jennifer Capriati did not only change tennis with her shots, her victories, and her World No.1 ranking. She also changed the way the world looks at children in professional sports. She showed everyone that behind the medals, the titles, and the admiration, there is still a human being with emotions, with trauma, with difficult days that few see. From her story, parents, coaches, and sports managers learned that there needs to be balance between developing talent and protecting childhood and children's mental health. And that true success is not only measured by the number of cups or titles, but by the ability to preserve their true selves. Jennifer Capriati became a role model for young athletes. That failure is not the end, that pressure can break, but resilience can heal. And through her own story, she opened a new chapter in the way the world views prodigies, those who are expected too early, that they also need to be loved, to be cared for, to live a full childhood in order to grow up in a complete way. The induction into the International Tennis Hall of Fame is a reminder that the true legacy of a champion lies not only on the court, but also in the lessons they leave for society. That Jennifer Capriati did not only rewrite tennis history with her serves, her shots, and her victories, but also by surviving trauma, by turning pain into strength, by changing the perception of talented children in every field of sports. And that very thing turned her from a child crushed by pressure into an enduring symbol. A person whose life story will continue to be remembered not only for the titles, but for the spirit, the resilience, and the inner strength she inspires in an entire generation, making people understand that the greatest success is not the glory on the court, but the ability to stand firm and become an example for those who are struggling to find themselves amid challenges that seem impossible to overcome. And when the spotlight on the court faded out completely, when the titles and medals became silent witnesses of a brilliant past, Jennifer Capriati still stood there, not as a perfect tennis player, not as a perfect life everyone imagined, but as a human being who had survived years that few could understand. A child crushed by pressure before she even had a chance to experience childhood. A girl who once cried quietly in a hotel room after a match. A teenager who felt lonely even when the whole of America watched her every step. And those very experiences had forged in her an inner strength that no title or award could compare to. Jennifer once had to face public collapse, arrest, doubt, judgment, and being forgotten. But she did not let those things define who she was. She walked through the darkness, walked through the days of depression, through physical and mental pain, and then, step by step, one step at a time, returned to the court, faced opponents, faced the audience, and most importantly, faced herself. She turned pain into motivation, turned failure into lessons. And each shot, each victory in the comeback phase, was not only proof of talent, but also proof of willpower, of the ability to rise after the whole world thought she had collapsed. And when Jennifer won the Australian Open title, the French Open, and reached the World No.1 ranking, those who had once doubted and criticized could not deny that she had come back. But Jennifer's true victory did not lie in the trophies or the rankings, but in the ability to overcome the cruelest ordeals that youth and pressure could create. And in every step, in every moment she stood on the court, one could see a person who had grown from trauma, a woman who had once been beaten down, now standing up with courage that only those who had been through loss could understand. Jennifer Capriati became a living symbol of resilience, not only for young tennis players but for all those who had ever faced pressure, failure, and loneliness. Her story reminds us that success is not forever, that childhood and innocence are just as precious as titles. But most important is the ability to rise again, the ability to learn how to walk on a path she herself chooses, not the path others imposed. And that is what made her a role model, a person honored not only for victories, but for the ability to survive, the ability to turn pain into strength and inspire future generations. A proof that an imperfect life can still become a symbol, that a child crushed by pressure can still become the woman who stands up after falling, and that sometimes the greatest lessons do not come from victories, but from the way a person knows how to stand up, look straight at the past, and keep moving forward even when the pain has never completely left. Some champions are remembered for their victories, but Jennifer Capriati will be remembered for something stronger than that. The courage to survive a dream that almost destroyed her. And when the court lights go out, when the audience leaves, when all the praises die down, Jennifer is still there, steady, strong, and real, living proof of resilience, perseverance, and the ability to turn tragedy into a story of hope and human strength. The story of Jennifer Capriati is a vivid proof that even young geniuses are not protected from the pressure, expectations, and loneliness that early success brings. At just 13 years old, she reached the semifinals of the French Open, then won Olympic gold at age 16. Those achievements made the whole of America and the world admire her. But behind the spotlight was a girl who lost her childhood, had no freedom, no friends, and had to live under the strict discipline of her father, where every shot on the court was seen as a test of her own value. The collapse in her teenage years, when she was arrested for theft and drug use, became a shock for the entire nation, causing the media to turn the prodigy into a national tragedy. But those very painful years forged Jennifer's willpower, helping her stand up and return to tennis with a comeback that amazed the whole world. With Australian Open titles, French Open, and the world #1 ranking, her story shows that the greatest victory is not medals or titles, but the ability to survive, the ability to rise after the whole world has turned its back, and the ability to hold on to herself even though her childhood had been lost. The lesson for the American people is clear. Pressure, expectations, or difficulties that seem impossible to overcome do not define a person's value. What matters is willpower, resilience, and the ability to recover on one's own. Jennifer Capriati not only teaches us about sports, but also about life, about how to face failure, how to find oneself again after tragedy, and how to turn pain into strength to keep moving forward, inspiring every generation that resilience and courage are the most lasting legacy a person can leave. If you feel that Jennifer Capriati's story is inspiring and touches your heart, please hit subscribe and leave a heart to honor her extraordinary resilience. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video as we explore other stories about people who dare to stand up after falling.